When I first met Harold Briggs, he was standing on a wooden ladder, his brush moving slow and steady across the clapboard siding of a white house on Elm Street. It was early summer, the kind of day when the air smells of cut grass and old paint. He didn't notice me at first. Most people didn't when he was painting. Harold had a way of disappearing into the rhythm of it, as if time itself held its breath while he worked. He was already in his late 60s then. Folks in town used to joke that if something didn't move fast enough, Harold would paint it. Storefronts, fences, mailboxes, barns, he'd painted them all, most of them more than once. He'd been the town's only painter since before the war, and everyone trusted his steady hand. What few people knew was that Harold kept a little black notebook in his back pocket, where he wrote the date and address of every job he ever did. "So I don't forget who I've been," he once said with a half smile. The house on Elm Street was familiar to him. He painted it first in 1928, when it belonged to the Thompsons, a young couple then, newlyweds with dreams and no money. He remembered how Mrs. Thompson insisted on yellow trim, because she said it made the house look like it was always in sunlight. He painted it again in '46, after the war, when the Thompsons' son came home to raise a family of his own. And now, in 1972, Harold found himself painting it once more, this time for the grandson of the very man who first hired him. "The strange thing about time," Harold used to say, "is that it doesn't move in a straight line. It loops and bends, folds back on itself like wet paper." Every stroke of his brush felt like touching 3 different years at once. The wood beneath his hand carried stories he could still hear if he listened closely: the laughter of the Thompsons' children, the hammering of nails when the porch was rebuilt, the quiet creak of the rocking chair where Mrs. Thompson once sat with her tea. At lunchtime, he'd sit under the same elm tree, unwrap a sandwich from wax paper, and stare at the road shimmering in the heat. The neighborhood had changed. Cars were newer, lawns smaller, but the rhythm of the street was the same. Children still chased one another past the white fences. Someone's radio played a tune he almost remembered, but couldn't name. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the paint took on a golden hue, Harold stood back to admire his work. The house looked just like it did in '28, only the laughter was missing. He ran his thumb along the rim of his paint can, feeling the dried flecks of color that told the story of every year he'd lived. There were bits of blue from the diner on Main, red from the firehouse, green from the old schoolhouse long torn down. Sometimes he wondered if all those colors still lived somewhere in him. If maybe painting wasn't just work, it was how he kept the past from fading completely. When he looked at the house now, he didn't just see white walls. He saw the lives that filled them, the summers that came and went, the faces that changed but somehow stayed the same. Before packing up for the day, Harold closed his black notebook and wrote a single line beneath the address: "Third time's the charm." Then, as he climbed down the ladder, the evening wind brushed against the wet paint, carrying with it the faint scent of something long remembered, like time itself had paused, just to watch him finish. The next morning, Harold woke before dawn, as he always did. The smell of turpentine lingered faintly on his hands, and his old truck sat waiting in the driveway, the back filled with brushes wrapped in rags and a half-empty can of white paint. He liked the quiet before the town awoke, the way the world seemed to exist only in shades of gray until the sun slowly began filling it in. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the tin pot and sat on his porch, watching the light spread across the street. The houses he'd painted over the years stood lined up like pages in a book he'd already read, but never quite finished. Some of those houses had been torn down. Others had changed colors so many times he barely recognized them. But in the cool stillness of morning, he could remember them all: the laughter, the hammering, the voices calling for one more coat before sundown. That day, his job was across town, an old farmhouse near the edge of the county road. It belonged to a woman named Eleanor Price. She'd recently returned after years away to settle her late parents' affairs. The house had been sitting empty for decades, the paint cracked and peeled by sun and time. When Harold arrived, Eleanor was standing in the yard, her arms folded, studying the house as if trying to remember what it used to feel like to call it home. "Mr. Briggs?" she asked, shading her eyes from the morning glare. "I'm told you've been painting around here longer than anyone else." Harold gave a slow nod. I suppose that's true. Long enough to know when Wood's tired of being ignored. She smiled faintly. Then you and I have something in common. He set down his gear and walked slowly around the house, running his fingers over the faded siding. It had once been a bright blue, the kind of color folks chose when they believed life could only get better. You want it the same as before? He asked. Eleanor hesitated. I'm not sure, she said. Maybe. My mother always loved that color, said it made her think of summer skies. I used to watch her polish the windows until they shone. After she died, I stopped coming here. Harold looked at her for a moment. Then maybe it's time to bring her summer back. She turned away, blinking fast, pretending to study the porch rails. Maybe it is. Over the next few weeks, Harold worked quietly, layer by layer, as he always did. Eleanor would sometimes come out to watch, bringing him lemonade or a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, just like the ones he made for himself. At first, they spoke little, only about the weather, the thickness of paint, or the stubbornness of the wood. But as the days passed, conversation began to flow more easily, the way sunlight seeps through a dusty window. She told him about her years in the city, about the noise and the rush, and how she never quite fit in. He told her about the town, about the families that had come and gone, and about the strange comfort of repetition. Every house I paint, he said, is like turning a page I've already read, but there's always something I missed the first time. Sometimes, when the late afternoon light turned golden, Eleanor would sit on the steps with a book while he worked. Harold liked hearing the soft sound of her turning pages. It felt like company without the need for words. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and sun-warmed grass, and he found himself remembering the summers of his youth, the hum of cicadas, his father's radio, the way time used to feel endless. One evening, as he packed his brushes, Eleanor spoke quietly. Do you ever feel like you've been painting your own life, stroke by stroke, without realizing it? Harold looked up from his paint can. Maybe that's all any of us do. Paint over the old parts, trying to keep the weather out. She smiled sadly. And what happens when there's nothing left to paint? He glanced at the fading sunset, the sky brushed with pink and gold. Then you stand back and see what you've made. For a long moment, they were both silent, listening to the rustle of the wind through the tall grass. The house glowed faintly in the twilight, its new coat of blue still wet in places. It looked alive again, like it remembered who it was. That night, when Harold got home, he opened his black notebook and added a new line beneath the day's date. The Price House Blue again. Feels like memory learning to breathe. Then he closed the book and sat for a long time on his porch, the smell of paint still clinging to his sleeves. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a train whistle blew, and Harold thought about how some things fade, not because they're forgotten, but because they've been remembered long enough to rest. A year passed before Harold saw Eleanor again. The seasons rolled by as they always did: spring rains, summer heat, the slow gold of autumn, and the town went on needing him. He painted barns and fences, schoolrooms and storefronts, and every so often, he passed the old Price house at the edge of the road. It looked strong again, like a story retold with care. The blue paint had softened into something gentle, and the porch flowers she planted were bright and stubborn against the wind. That winter had been long. The cold settled into Harold's bones in ways it hadn't before. He took fewer jobs and moved slower, but still carried his brush with the same quiet pride. There was something sacred, he thought, about restoring what time tried to take away. One April morning, a letter arrived handwritten in blue ink. He recognized the neat, slanted script before even reading the name. Eleanor Price. Inside was a short note. Mr. Briggs, I've gone back to the city for a while. The house looks beautiful, just as I remembered it when I was a girl. Thank you for giving it that piece of my mother's sky again. If you ever pass by, there's something waiting for you on the porch. Warm regards, Eleanor. Harold folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his notebook. That weekend, he drove out toward the edge of town. The air was bright and cool, the kind that carried the smell of earth after rain. When he reached the farmhouse, the gate creaked just like it always had. The front porch sat in sunlight, and there, beside the rocking chair, was a small wooden box with his name painted across the top. Inside was a folded handkerchief wrapped around a small brass key and another note. You once told me paint keeps the weather out. I think maybe it keeps people in too. This was my mother's key to the attic. She used to keep her journals up there, pages filled with sketches of rooms she wanted to paint, colors she hoped to use one day. I think she'd have liked you to have them. She said anyone who can bring color back to silence must understand something about time. He stood there for a long moment, the key cool in his hand. The wind rustled through the tall grass, and he thought of Eleanor's mother, her laughter, her hands polishing the windows until they gleamed. Then he stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish. The sunlight slipped through the curtains, dust motes drifting like slow snowflakes. Harold climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the boards creaking softly beneath him. At the top, he found a trunk beneath the eaves. It was full of books and fabric scraps, tiny sketches of rooms and color samples carefully labeled: morning blue, porch white, harvest yellow. Each page felt like a whisper from someone who had loved light, someone who had believed that color could hold warmth long after laughter faded. He spent the afternoon sitting on the floorboards, turning through the pages one by one. In the corner of one book, he noticed a date: 1928, the same year he'd first painted the Thompson house on Elm Street. He smiled softly. The same colors, the same hands, the same summers. Time really did loop, he thought. As the daylight began to fade, he found a final entry written in faded ink. If someone ever repaints this house, I hope they love it enough to see what we tried to preserve, not just wood and walls, but what those walls once heard. Harold closed the book and exhaled slowly. He painted hundreds of homes, maybe thousands, but in that quiet attic, he understood what he had truly been doing all his life. He wasn't covering the past. He was keeping it from disappearing. Each coat was a thank you, a layer of care that said, "You mattered once, and still do." Before leaving, he found a small, unused can of blue paint tucked beside the trunk. He opened it, dipped his finger in, and smiled. It was still good, the color of morning skies, just as Eleanor's mother had written. He locked the attic door behind him and left the key on the table, beneath the note that read, "Thank you." As he stepped off the porch, the horizon glowed pink with the setting sun, and the house behind him seemed to hum softly in the light. That evening, when he got home, Harold opened his notebook again. The pages were nearly full now, decades of work recorded in tiny, careful lines. But this time, he didn't write an address or a date. He simply wrote, "I used to think paint covered things. Now, think it remembers them." He closed the book gently and stared at his hands. They were rough and spotted with age, the color of pine bark, but steady still. Maybe one day soon, someone else would paint the houses, fix the fences, mend what time hadn't done. But until that day came, he'd keep doing what he always had, layer by layer, memory by memory. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that as long as color could cling to wood, a part of him would never fade. By the time autumn rolled around again, Harold's knees had grown weaker, and the cold crept into his joints earlier each morning. His hands still remembered every motion of the brush, but they trembled now, just a little, when he mixed the paint. The house on Elm Street had already faded slightly since last year's job, and the blue of the Price place had softened into a gentler shade like the past, slowly letting go of its sharpness. He hadn't heard from Eleanor since that last summer. He'd meant to stop by, maybe to bring her a jar of varnish or one of his old brushes she'd liked to borrow when she helped him touch up the porch rail. But weeks had turned to months, and then to seasons, and somehow he never made it back. One crisp October morning, Harold's phone rang. It was the postmaster, who told him a letter had arrived for him. No return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Eleanor's, neat and deliberate, like the way she spoke. He opened it carefully at his kitchen table, the faint scent of lavender rising from the paper. "Dear Mr. Briggs, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to say goodbye properly. I left for the coast. The house sold quicker than I expected. Before I went, I wanted to thank you. You didn't just paint an old house, Harold. You brought it back to life. You reminded me that walls hold more than dust and echoes. They hold the shape of the people who loved them. When I see the color blue now, think of home again. I hope you know what a gift that is. With gratitude, Eleanor, he folded the letter slowly, his eyes tracing the fading ink. Outside, the leaves were turning, and a pale light filtered through the trees, the kind of light that makes everything look both young and old at the same time. He slipped the letter into his notebook between the pages where he kept the addresses, the dates, the colors, the record of his quiet life's work. That afternoon, he drove back to Elm Street one more time. The house stood shining in the low sun, its third coat still strong after all these years. The young man who lived there now, the grandson of the Thompsons, came out to wave. "Hey, Mr. Briggs," he called. "You think it'll need another coat next spring?" Harold smiled faintly. "Everything does, eventually." He parked his truck beneath the elm tree and sat for a while, listening to the soft sounds of the neighborhood children playing, someone hammering a board, the whistle of the train passing in the distance. He closed his eyes and felt the warmth of the day settle over him. In that quiet moment, he realized something he'd never said out loud. He spent his life just painting houses. He'd spent it preserving time one brushstroke at a time, one story layered over another. Every home he'd worked on was a memory he'd helped keep standing against the weather. The white fences he'd painted were now silvered with age. The red barn on Carter's farm had long turned brown, but each held a trace of him and of the people who'd once laughed inside their walls. The town was full of ghosts, not the haunting kind, but the gentle kind that live in the scent of paint, the creak of old porches, the places where someone once cared enough to stay. When Harold finally packed up his truck, he took one last look at the houses that lined Elm Street. Each one, in some way, was as a chapter in a book that no one would ever write, but everyone could still read, if they paid attention. He started the engine, but before pulling away, he opened his black notebook one last time. The final page was almost full. Only one small space left at the bottom. With his shaky hand, he wrote, "Paint fades. Stories don't." He smiled, closed the notebook, and placed it carefully on the passenger seat beside him. As he drove away, the wind rippled through the elm branches, carrying the faint scent of fresh paint from a house down the street. The sound of children's laughter echoed faintly through the afternoon, and for the first time in a long time, Harold felt something like peace. Somewhere in the distance, the sun dipped lower, catching on the white siding of the homes he'd painted decades ago, shining just enough to make them look newly born again. And in that moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped, just long enough to say thank you. There are stories that don't shout to be heard. They live quietly in the smell of rain on old paint, in the creak of a porch step that still remembers the weight of someone long gone. Harold's story was one of them. He didn't leave behind monuments or headlines, only colors that faded slowly, and memories that refused to. Sometimes, it's not the big things that define a life. It's the brushstrokes, the small, steady acts of care that keep the world from crumbling. Maybe you have someone like that in your memory. Someone who built, fixed, painted, or simply stayed long enough for others to keep going. If you close your eyes, you can almost smell the paint drying in the afternoon sun. You can hear the echo of laughter behind a newly opened window. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand that what Harold really left behind wasn't a row of houses, it was a lesson that time always fades, but kindness never does. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a face, a sound you thought you'd forgotten, don't let it slip away. Share it in the comments below. Tell us who your Harold was, the one who kept life beautiful in quiet ways. And if you believe that stories like this still matter, that small lives can still carry big meanings, then help us keep them alive. Like, subscribe, and stay with us as we keep painting these forgotten corners of time, one story, one memory, one brushstroke at a time.